Bienvenido. Buenos dias. Buenos dias. Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid that's as much Spanish as you'll get out of me today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Automotive Logistics Conference. Very briefly, before we really get going, we have translation headsets. The conference will be simultaneously translated between English and Spanish. There will be a number of presentations in both languages, so please, if you need it, the headsets are available just to the left outside the conference room. You can give a business card, and just please do remember to bring them back after the event or before you leave the event. They have no use to you whatsoever afterwards to translate. Again, my name is Christopher Ludwig. I'm the Group Content Director here at Automotive Logistics. I'll be, together with my colleague Richard Logan, hosting the conference for you over the next 2 days. And we really have quite a packed agenda and special event today. So I'm not going to spend too much time kind of lingering over things, but I wanted to first briefly make you aware of our conference app. So if you haven't already, please download it, where you can see the schedule and the speakers throughout the day. And a special thank you as well to our sponsors of the event, our premier sponsor Penske, our global sponsors CNW, Jeffco, Ryder, Horizon Auto Logistics, Wallenius Wilhelmsen, Trinity Rail, CSI, and our silver sponsors Chapman Freeborn, KHS Global Automotive Solutions, Confezione Adria Group, and also our innovation sponsor Freight Verify. We also have a number of media sponsors and partners that we thank as well. Our first speaker, whom I'm going to bring on in a moment, we're really pleased to have him here at this event, given what's happening in the world. As you know, we live in uncertain times. We live in a world of slowing global trade, of slowing global vehicle sales, of price pressure, coronavirus. The list sort of goes on. There's been many trade tensions over the years, and Mexico has certainly known this as better than ever. But Mexico has an advantage, I think. One, I think few cultures are as good at dealing with adversity and uncertainty as Mexico. You just have to look at the country's history to know that. And certainly the last couple of years with the negotiations over NAFTA and the now USMCA trade agreement, speak to that. But we're on a more positive note now with the deal ratified in Mexico and in the US and coming up in Canada. And so we are, I think, coming to a much more certain time. That's why I'm so pleased we're able to have our keynote guest speaker today, who is the Undersecretary for North America for the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he was the chief NAFTA negotiator during the recent USMCA, or as we should really call it here, the TMEC agreement under President López Obrador. And so he really has unprecedented insight into what has gone into that trade negotiation, and of course its implications for the automotive industry and of course for the supply chain. Mr. Jesus Seade has had a remarkable career in international trade relations, including as Mexico's multilateral ambassador in the creation of the World Trade Organization. He's also had a number of leading roles at the WTO, at the World Bank, and at the International Monetary Fund. And so we are extremely grateful to have Mr. Seade here. He will present. He will talk to us first, and then he'll be available immediately afterwards for some Q&A. I just wanted to make sure that Mr. Seade is ready. May I bring you onto the stage now, Mr. Seade? So it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Jesus Seade. And also a very important cup of coffee as
Coffee,
yeah.
coffee was just coming, as you call me.
Absolutely. We're very pleased to have you.
Hello, Christopher. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much. So you're welcome to present here or at the podium, however you like. Yeah. So did you want to start with some words?
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, you can start over here.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, well, good morning, everybody. I thank Automotive Logistics Mexico for the invitation, the opportunity to meet with you, and I thank all of you for listening. I guess I should be talking a little bit, not so much about, somewhat about your sector, but also about the environment, the agreement. First of all, I just spoke the last hour and a half, twice, with the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, who is the Chief Negotiator for Canada. Things are going kind of bumpy, but I think there's no doubt that there'll be approval of the agreement with a lot of haggling and so on, but nothing unexpected. As you know, the government in power, the party in power, the Liberals, who were also in power before, and they were the ones who negotiated the deal. Of course, they are in favor of the deal, but they won a minority government. It's a parliamentary system, and so they have the largest minority. And the other big party in the country, which are the Conservatives, also supports the agreement. So there was never any doubt that there would be ratification, approval. Nevertheless, the chemistry between those two parties is not great, of course. I mean, one of them beat the other one recently in a very tight race. So there's a lot of raising questions and things. The government seeking support from other smaller parties, from Quebec, from others. But I believe the expectation is that the committee level work in Parliament will be completed, the approval at committee level, within this week and next. And then within March, comfortably within March, hopefully, will be the completion of the ratification. Now, what is it that we are ratifying? Well, let me go a little bit historically to the NAFTA to basically make my main points on what is new, what is being brought by this new agreement. NAFTA was a deal that transformed your industry, among others, absolutely radically. Through NAFTA, Mexico in particular went from being a one product exporter, and that product was oil, basically, to becoming a fairly sophisticated industrial export base. By far the largest exporter in Latin America. In fact, Mexican exports are bigger than the exports of all other countries in Latin America added together. But perhaps more important than the volume of exports is the fact that these exports have become highly diversified. Broader spectrum of manufacturers, also a much broader spectrum of agricultural production and export than we had before. So all the more technologically inclined agriculture has also developed a lot, fruits, vegetables, all that. So it's been a great vehicle for the integration of the region. Trade has expanded massively between any combination of the three countries. Mexico has become by now the largest trading partner of the United States. Trade with Canada has increased, it's getting close, pushing towards the tenfold increase over the life of NAFTA. Nevertheless, the NAFTA had one birth defect, one flaw, one gap that negotiators were always very sorry about, and maybe some of you, your legal counsels in the companies maybe, but in general the public and even industry, not very well aware of what was missing, because it was missing. And normally you don't miss something that is not there. Something bad you may hate. But something that is not present is not necessarily recognized as being an undesirable absentee. And I'm talking about the proper functioning dispute settlement system, state to state. This was something that, of course, was negotiated in NAFTA. There's a beautiful Chapter 20 for disputes between countries. In fact, Chapter 20 became a template, in large measure, for dispute settlement in other trade agreements, United States with anybody, Mexico with anybody, or other countries, third parties in Asia or Europe. Nevertheless, the dispute settlement system never became functional because right at the beginning, the countries did not come to an agreement on the list of panelists that you had to agree before entering into force. And what didn't happen before entering into force never happened in 25 years. It was a very high priority. When we came to these negotiations, so that's all I say about NAFTA, then we come to the USMCA or TMEC negotiations, part 1. So let me talk about what was signed by President Trump, Prime Minister Trudeau, and former President of Mexico, Peña Nieto. That agreement, negotiated in 2017, 2018, I think it's a very significant improvement on NAFTA. You have different views, of course, you may. The car industry is particularly affected, for good or for bad, particularly affected. But it's a major change in many respects. The first thing that I think has to be underscored is that the bulk of the agreement, the disciplines, are much improved. Lots of ambiguities in the NAFTA were tightened, were made more precise, timelines were made more realistic, places where they didn't function. Rules were created where they didn't exist. Obvious example, electronic trade. So that's one major, I think, very important area of change, of what does the new agreement bring over the NAFTA. Second is the one that is central to you, the rules of origin. Across the board in manufacturers, a number of sectors where the rules of origin were negotiated. I don't have to explain to you the rules that you have to satisfy for trade to be unimpeded within the region on a duty-free basis. For the car industry, it means more than duty-free. It also means certain security against certain actions that never existed before, but in the United States were invented a couple of years ago on national security. The rules of origin in general, before I say a word about your sector, in general, in all the sectors, are increased. So it becomes harder, whether you are in the chemicals business or in electronics or in white line, electrical goods, or in textiles, or in the car industry and all the vehicles industry and parts. Across the board, the rules become tighter. So the agreement makes it less easy to import into the value chain from the rest of the world. So in the case of your industry, when speaking about the light vehicles subsector or sector, the cars, the requirement is 75% of the cost, which is huge. I don't have to tell you, it's huge. So if you are Toyota, if you are BMW, if you are Kia from Korea, you can no longer bring to the region up to 37.5% that you could bring, or you can even now bring under NAFTA. The 37 shrinks to only 25%, and 75% has to be incurred in the region. And not only that, as you know, lots of conditions in your sector, a number of major components in the car have to be from the region. The engine from the region means 75% in each case. The engine and suspension and transmission and steering and the chassis and the battery and the bodywork. So you can continue to bring from outside without any restriction. The ashtrays, and I can remember, I don't have the full list of items. So it really becomes very much a requirement of you produce your cars in large measure in North America, and you bring from North America. And the same, although the rules are simpler, is true in other sectors in manufacturers. Now, what does that mean for the industry? Well, of course, the producers of cars and vans and trucks most prefer not to have the restriction. I mean, any new restriction forces you to do something that was not optimal in the previous situation. So by definition, it has to be something that you argue against. And nevertheless, my hunch from day one after the negotiations were completed was that this would be good for Mexico, because the changes were not changes that the industry, by and large, would be able to meet. And if they can meet it, if they can meet them, the changes, if you can meet the changes, then of course you're not going to turn your back on the region and say, no, it's too costly and too problematic. I will concentrate on producing and selling into the Australian and South American markets. You cannot turn your back on the United States. It is central. And the United States now becomes more integrated through this new agreement with Canada and Mexico. So I am not a protectionist. I would never preach for rules that make trade more difficult to force industry into my country. If this were a policy being passed by Mexico in isolation, or by Mexico in the context of a treaty with Colombia, Peru, and Chile, the Pacific Alliance, if this were that the context, I would be completely against. Because that's exactly what we tried and did in the 1960s and 70s. It worked for a while, and it came to a limit. Because what you're doing is to say to industry outside the country, well, you cannot continue to export into my country as well as you have been doing. If you want to sell in my country, you have to jump the barrier that I have set for you and invest. And the result was that, they would invest in Mexico in the 60s and 70s to capture the Mexican market, which is a good market, but a limited market. But the limit comes soon. And once that limit begins to be reached, the foreign company will not be very interested. So the market becomes captive to the domestic industry. Domestic industry, without the international competition as lively as it should have been. And the result is that domestic industry loses its sharpness, becomes lazy, and the consumer loses. But the situation now is completely different. Now we are telling you, the industry, yes, you have some protection if you invest in Mexico or anywhere in North America, of course. But let me think in terms of this market. You have added protection, and in exchange, I give you not the Mexican market, which was the trade, the quid pro quo, 50 years ago? No, the quid pro quo is I protect the industry in Mexico, and I give you the North American market. So the result, of course, has to be, I reasoned from day one, that companies will find it attractive to adjust and to expand the investment, and will find it very profitable to do so. And lo and behold, a number of companies, I think my latest count was at least 7 major manufacturers have made announcements in the last 14 months of expansion of production in Mexico. Not all of those have materialized, but at least 3 or so have expanded in a significant way among you. Others are lining up to come in, Chinese producers. A report with the aggregate figures just came out. I was reading it yesterday, I think. The biggest success story for Mexico in terms of attracting foreign investment last year was the car and parts industry. So I think it is a good agreement for Mexico and a good agreement for the industry, and I've been talking about cars and trucks. Of course, for car parts, it has to be a great agreement because you are telling them you produce here and you have more of the market for yourselves. So all in all, I think it's a good set of provisions for Mexico. As I said, that was my belief from the beginning. The numbers have more or less spoken to that effect, and I look optimistically towards the future. Of course, we have to work with you. There has to be a good industrial policy. And what is industrial policy? It used to be subsidies and things. There's no money and there's no interest in going that way. Of course, that's not the way to go. But industrial policy to me is simply working together, government and industry, working together, meeting and understanding what do I need to do, government, to make it easier for you to invest, to be efficient, to gain, to come here. I don't know, for example, of all the major manufacturers, one that has a particular problem is Tesla, whose batteries are made in Japan, and batteries is one of the main components that have to be produced in the region. So there are plans to build a plant with Panasonic in Texas, and I see no reason why that shouldn't be in Mexico. I think it's a better venue. So with a good partnership, government, industry, I think the industry has every prospect to become a real dynamo for the regional economy or for the world economy, the Mexican car and parts industry. Now, that is my second leg of major results from the USMCA negotiations as of 2018. The third major component I think is worth bringing out, mentioning, is one that you have seen in parts. You know, there's a labor reform. But it's not only a labor reform, it's a number of chapters that are not standard in a trade agreement, are not narrowly commercial. They are more going into what I call the social agenda. The world has become a very complicated place the last 10, 15 years, maybe since the big crisis in 2007 and 8. It was an explosion of complaints everywhere, from Manhattan to Mexico to South America to France to England with Brexit to Hong Kong, of course. I think the common denominator is that there's been a more express rejection of a development model for the world that by nature, without anybody being evil, by nature, trade is easier and easier around the world, where you would never dream of importing into Argentina from China. It's too far. Now, of course, it's in the shelves. You have Japanese fruit in the shelves in Mexico. You have Mexican fruit in the shelves in China. You have whole racks in small town markets in China full of Bimbo bakery products. I can tell you, I have seen markets where the only bakery product in China offered is from Mexico. So the world is really very, very integrated. And this integration, of course, it's easier to face it and to operate if you're big. So the benefits have gone more to the big corporations and has given incentive, an economic rationale basis, a business basis for firms to concentrate, to agglomerate, for big firms to take over small firms. It's all very natural. But society says, hey, what's going on? Income concentration gets more and more concentrated and so on. So there are a number of chapters that respond to this, not because of any social agenda by the negotiators, but because these are needs that our governments face and have. And I'm talking, of course, of the labor chapter, which is huge, hugely important. The labor reform in Mexico is a fundamental change for this economy. It's really modernizing Mexico, bringing Mexico to the 21st century. That's the most important part. For Mexico, to me, that's the most important part of the whole agreement. Then you have also a decent, a fairly ambitious environment chapter. It doesn't mention the words climate change, so there are things that could have been done. But for other areas, it is quite a good agreement. You have an anti-corruption chapter. You have a chapter completely novel, and I'm sure will be replicated in other agreements in the future, on creating space to support small and medium enterprises, to enable business sectors and enable governments to look for and create mechanisms to give those small enterprises scale. Maybe you can have 20 producers producing into a single brand, or coalescing to negotiate financing collectively, or different kinds of things. And the agreement is very aware and very oriented to the support of small and medium enterprises. So all those, to me, make this agreement, as negotiated in 2018, a great improvement on what already was a solid and good agreement, the NAFTA. Okay? So the modernization and new rules, the rules of origin that may not work for the next 50 years, but I think are very good at least for the next 5-10 years at least, and then countries can revise. We have a revision clause every 6 years. And finally, this social set of areas. Nevertheless, there were two main things that we didn't like, or at least some of us didn't like, in the results that came out in 2018. One that some of us didn't like was the agreement on biomedicines. Biomedicines are the medicines that began to be created 15 years ago or so, using live tissue or using viruses, which are all the rage in medicine today. All the frontline medicines against cancer and Alzheimer's are medicines of this biological origin. They are incredibly expensive. In many cases, it's more the rule than the exception, that a single dose will cost you $2,000-3,000 US. You may need 8 doses a month. So it's really very, very expensive. So societies everywhere will have to rely in large measure on generics that come online after a number of years. So it depends for how long you protect the branded medicine. Canada protects them for 8 years, which seems to me like a good balance. Mexico, only 5 years. The United States, 12 years. Well, in that difficult negotiation, extremely tense negotiation, the 12 in the United States and the 5 in Mexico met a compromise point, not very much compromise point. It was 10. 12, 5, 10. And many people in Mexico felt that, everybody in Mexico consumes generics. So, not everybody, but a lot of the time, depends on the medicine, of course. So this was a negative for Mexican society at large, although, of course, there has to be a balance, or has to respect the need for research and for incentives for development. The other thing that we didn't like, and on this one it was everybody on the Mexican side and on the Canadian side, was the fact, and I think most people, experts on the US side, but not in the actual negotiation. And this is the fact that the birth defect that I started with that the NAFTA had and has, the absence of effective state-to-state panels remained. There was opposition. The negotiators from the US side wanted to have continuation of the traditional approach, which is an ad hoc case-by-case treatment of each dispute. But this ad hoc case-by-case treatment of disputes doesn't really work. If you look at all the major disputes Canada and the United States have had, or Mexico and the United States have had in the last 25 years, well, they just call for ministers to meet and say, hey, I have this problem in sugar, or in tuna, or in avocado, or in tomato, or in grapes. All these are major cases that have come up in the last 26 years. The only ones that are not agriculture, and there have also been major disputes, have been land transportation that was supposed to be opened up with the NAFTA and was never opened, and then steel and aluminum. That is of great interest to you, and that where the sector was slapped with national security duties, I don't know exactly the month, but 2.5 years ago or so. And for most countries that receive those duties, they stay in place. Mexico managed to get out on a free market basis without quotas last May, I think, and Canada followed suit. But all those disputes, most of them in the agricultural sector, so not your direct business interest, all those disputes were never resolved in many cases, never resolved. Tuna and avocado and sugar and tomato have never been resolved. And to the extent that they are resolved, were resolved in a way that doesn't give a lot of confidence to business. So I submit to you that for you in the car industry and parts, it is of great importance to have an environment where business relations are dealt with just as you do business with each other. You sign a contract and you know where you stand. You know what are your rights, your obligations. Well, the 2008 agreement, 2018 version 1 of the USMCA did not achieve correcting that. We come to the last leg. The Democratic Party of the United States led demand for changes all over last year. And of course, the changes were motivated, as you know, by the Labor Part. Why the Labor Part? Nobody among trade unions or Democrat Party ever said one word negative about what was agreed. What was agreed, the labor reform, is very ambitious and very modern. What they were objecting to was the fact that, well, what guarantees do I have that Mexico will do what it is committing to do? What guarantees do I have that I can force Mexico to do something if Mexico is not doing it? So after a whole year of awful, I assure you, haggling, a very strange negotiation with the Democrats and the administration negotiating constantly, and then the administration with Mexico negotiating constantly, but never the three together. At the end of that, one of the major concerns of the Democrats, which was this, how can I enforce the obligations that Mexico has agreed to, was precisely to remedy the dispute settlement system. And in my judgment, this is as big a result of the final package as any other major result. It is a completely first order of importance result. Because now, North America will be having more intense economic relations, trade relations, investment relations, but with a good platform of law and order, if you want, effective resolution of disputes on a rules-based system that gives business more predictability, not only gives Mexico more predictability or Canada, but gives business. So I believe that's very important. The biologics also get remedied. The Democrats were very concerned about generics. They wanted to introduce flexibility into the agreement, meaning what? Because the United States has 12 years protection, so changing the agreement wouldn't do anything for them. So they wanted flexibility. If and when the United States decides to lower that level of protection, to give more weight to the generics, even when that happens, we want the agreement to accommodate. And of course, our response was, be my guest, you want flexibility, but if there's flexibility, there should be an echo in terms of benefits also for Mexico. And after endless discussions on how this could be done and different formulations, the proposal from the Democrats, which we found absolutely fine, agreeable, and so that is the final outcome, is that the clause imposing a common length of protection among the three countries disappears. So countries are left to decide what is best for them. And Mexico will surely increase the 5 years of protection. They have to. But anyway, so those are the main changes. And just summarizing briefly what is different between the NAFTA and the USMCA as finally ratified in the United States and Mexico, and now it's in the pipeline for ratification soon in Canada. Well, the main changes are tighter rules of origin that make value chain trade outside the region more difficult and invites everybody to produce more, to invest more in the region across all manufacturers. A modernization and so on, the electronic trade rules. The social chapters in particular, I stress the importance of labor and small and medium enterprise provisions, which I quite like. And then finally, the creation of a new, well-functioning, I hope, we still have to work on it, system to resolve disputes. Sorry to have gone a little bit too long, but I wanted to give you an overall perspective. You know a million times more than I about your sector. I'll be happy to try to discuss if you have any questions on this or that. Thank you.
Gracias.
Sí.
Muchas gracias, Senor Ciade. That was a fantastic overview. As I mentioned at the beginning, you don't get more direct insight and input from the those who are around the negotiating table.
The horse.
Yeah.
The horse's mouth.
Right from the horse's mouth, exactly. Can you come to the UK and help us with Brexit? I think that's my first question. I know we've run a bit over time from our...
You're talking of the blunder of the century?
The blunder of the century. You heard it here. I'm glad to hear that. I know we're running a bit over time, but I think, again, that insight is really of so much value. But so there is some time for questions here. If there is a microphone, if there's anyone from the audience would like to pose a question, just put your hand up and we'll have a mic and you can say your company. If not, then that's great. But I'll use my prerogative. Oh, there is one. Okay, we'll start with a question right there from the audience.
People there.
It's very interesting for the industry, and it's how these rules, these uniform rules are moving on. We know that the agreement has changed. There are rules of origin that are known by the industry, but these rules of the game are essential to know how we're going to measure these changes.
Es un elemento fundamental.
Essential and substantial element for those who are not 100% clear of what we are talking about. There's a series of things, like 20 issues, that are not negotiated in detail. Negotiations include a clause that states, well, when the treaty is once signed and negotiated, and before it becomes effective, we have to do a series of things, like 20 things, rules of procedure, etc. But out of the 20 things, 2 of them are substantial. One of them are the uniform rules, which is to translate in detail the commitments that were taken upon each country in the rules of origin. For instance, 70% of steel has to come from the region. That has to be complied with by every company, Toyota and Volkswagen, and every model. Jetta has to comply with it, and other models. Or maybe you can do it by plant. There are different ways to interpret this global commitment, as well as the global cost of 75%, etc. This is one of the 2 substantial issues that we have to sort out. And the other one is also very important, and it is that for the system, the importance of which I established very well, we have to agree for the different settlement. We have to agree on the roster before the effective date. So these are all things that are being done by the Ministry of Economy. I suppose I talked to them. I suppose they are making good progress. They created a small group to receive support from other ministries, but this is essentially something that they are undertaking. Yesterday, there was a letter circulating that I received from you, from the sector, asking for more information and reflecting this question that is being asked right now. And this surprises me because I suppose there is a close relationship. I wouldn't dare negotiate any aspect of the uniform rules without consulting with you and asking you what's best for us, because doing it in a way that just sounds can be done in one morning, but I need to know what's going to affect us or not. Well, I don't know. As I read from this letter and from what I'm hearing right now, we don't have the communication we should be having, but this is something that is being led by the Ministry of Economy. I'm going to convey them the message that it's necessary, it's required to have a better communication with this industry. But we're moving forward, and we better agree on that before the effective date. Otherwise, afterwards, it's going to be very hard to determine a reading of it and an interpreting of this. Or we could have the influence of people who are very good but have a certain interest.
In effect, protecting the region, making it somewhat more difficult for international parts coming into the value chain, but in fact opening further and within North America as such. Do you see risks there in the sense that for this industry, for example, the automotive industry, something like 80% of the production goes to the US and Canada, obviously highly concentrated. When those markets are saturated or in decline, as we may see in the coming years, then obviously Mexican industry it declines with it, in effect. There's a sort of risk of not being more open to other parts of the world. Do you see risks there, or do you think Mexico's external trade deals and position with Asia, South America, Europe, for example, will allow it to balance some of these risks?
Honestly, I see less risk to Mexico or to the Mexican industry as such on that than to the region. The region may, if this were cast in stone and can never change, may come to regret this kind of inward-lookedness in 8 years or 10 years from now. Mexico, the industry has the additional advantage that whatever the dynamics of the region may be, we have a huge market, and whoever sets up shop in Mexico has a greater share and an assured share of this gigantic market over Mexico, where it is growing or growing not so much or stable, a nice way to say stagnant for 1 year. The opportunity doesn't disappear for us. So I think it's not something that I would recommend to North America for the long haul. Nevertheless, we have the revision clause. We have a commitment to renegotiate whatever may be in need for renegotiation. And I'm positive that in the 3 countries, certainly in Mexico, it's also my impression about the United States at least, there's a much less patience than in the past with governments doing whatever they want to do. So there will be more cooperation, more connivance between industry and government. So come the year, 2025, preparing for the revision in 2026, you and us, I may not be there, but in a generic way, should be talking and try to revise the agreement in various areas, including this one. You can adjust the parameters. You don't have to go for a big bang change in policy. You can adjust the parameters. 70% turned out to be a little too high for steel. Let's make it 68. No, I think you can adjust, and I think we need to adjust into the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I have the feeling that we could talk probably all day and probably still have more questions to ask, but I am aware that we've run somewhat over time and we have other things that we would like to be sharing with our audience. So I would like to thank you, Mr. Yade, for your excellent presentation and your insights. I'm not sure if you're going to be here for a little while. Perhaps there may be some further questions on your way out, I'm sure, from other delegates, but if not, we really appreciate the time and for coming and joining us today.
It's a great pleasure, and I'm always open for engagement. Yeah,
fantastic.
absolutely.
Well, we're very happy to facilitate that for other questions that may come.
Okay. Encantado, gracias. Thank you very much.
So, but again, thanks again there. We want to move on to our next presentation, which is actually going to give you a bit more insight into some of the overarching trends and economic factors affecting the automotive industry in Mexico. I'd like to welcome Javier Quijano, Senior Manager for Global Trade at EY. Javier? There you are, Javier. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Buenos días. Mi nombre es Javier Quijano.
Everyone, my name is Javier Quijano. I come from the practice of global trade of Ernst & Young, based in Detroit, Michigan. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the automotive industry in Mexico, both in manufacture and the future perspective, and also the sales of vehicles in Mexico. We're going to be talking a little bit about the trends for electric vehicles, which seems to be the future, and a little bit about the disruptors in the market. So, talking a little bit about the overall market in 2019, the automotive sector in Mexico, including components, not only vehicle manufacture, surpassed 3.5, the GDP of Mexico, 3.5%, employing over 1.5 million people, both in plants and the auto parts sector. More than 4 million vehicles were produced. 2018 was a record year for production. 2019 fell back a little bit, but we're going to be seeing the future trends regarding this. And in the topic of vehicles that are manufactured in Mexico, 75% of them are exported to the US, 80% of them are exported in general. So the change in the US market will have a direct impact in the production levels in Mexico. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. And over 1.3 million vehicles were sold in Mexico in the last year. We saw a reduction in the sales of vehicles in the last 3 years. We're going to delve into the reasons. Mexico continues to be a country that is very attractive for the manufacture of the vehicle sector, both auto parts and vehicles, mainly because of its geographic location next to the U.S., the best market for Mexico, the number of trade agreements that Mexico holds with several different countries, the government incentives for foreign direct investment in Mexico, and this is a country that produces in low cost, both logistics because of our close markets and also production costs. And we can see that with the opening of new plants in Mexico recently. Now, moving a little bit into figures, how we have seen manufacture in Mexico, we're going to seeing passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles in Mexico. And it's been going up and down in the last years. Generally speaking, we've been seeing a growing trend in passenger vehicles, but in the last 2 years, we saw a fall in manufacture in Mexico. Why is that? First, the uncertainty of USMCA, is it going to be signed or not, when it's the effective date, and that decelerated the market. And also, we mentioned the export market, which is very important to Mexico. When in the US and in Canada, the demand for vehicles started changing, it affected our production here. Mainly, the demand for SUVs increased in the US and Canada, and it wasn't necessarily what was being made in Mexico, so that produces a decline in production. We, however, also have opportunities. Not everything is going down. With the CTTPP, with the ACE 55, we have new opportunities for Mexico, and the trend or the projection into the future is a sustained growth after the couple of years where we have a decline, to have a slight growth at least till 2025. In commercial vehicles or heavy vehicles, the story is different. We have been showing very significant growths, except for 2016, but we are going to see a deceleration in the next years. And mainly, why? Because plants in Mexico are reaching their full capacity. So if there is no investment to expand them for heavy vehicles, we won't be able to manufacture more. However, the growth that we're projecting is surpassing the growth of passenger vehicles. Mexico's domestic automotive market, cars sold in Mexico, has also been going up and down in the last 2 years, mainly, as we can see. In January this year, it was in all papers that in January there was a 6% fall in vehicle sales, and we have keeping a track of 3 years of deceleration. But we expect a new increase in the sales of vehicles because Mexican economy could grow and better access to credits for the consumer, and we are also expecting an increase in salaries in Mexico. So this will, of course, cause additional sales of vehicles, although the growth will not be as the one seen in last years. It's nevertheless growth. In commercial vehicles, we'll see a stable growth. Some infrastructure projects in Mexico will require commercial vehicles. There are new environmental regulations that are also renewing fleets, and we expect new access to credit for the purchase of commercial vehicles as well. The electric vehicle market in Mexico went up or soared in 2018, 2019. 2018 finished with over 21,000 units in Mexico, less than 1% of total vehicle sales, but they are growing. 21,000 in 2018, and then exponential growth. We have 30 different models in Mexico, both hybrid and only electric, both luxury and regular. And we are starting to talk about production. Mark E in Naucalpan by Ford, Thalia, which is a Mexican vehicle that will be made in Mexico. And there are incentives, or should be incentives, in Mexico from the government to promote the sales of electric vehicles due to environmental reasons. So the expectation is for this market to continue growing, although they have a minimal participation in the, or minimal share in the whole market. There are expectations for growth. I went very fast because I wanted to stop at market disruptors. What is causing these figures that we were just saying? Well, the first thing I would mention is uncertainty. We have economic uncertainty and trade uncertainty that we have been seeing in the past. What do I mean by economic? Well, the growth of the economy in Mexico, matters like Uber and Lyft, that start reducing the demand for vehicles because now it's easier to ask for an Uber than to purchase your own car. But we also have commercial disruptors. As I mentioned a while ago, the sign of the treaty or the tariffs against Mexico for migration reasons, or the China tariffs. We're seeing commercial disruption as never seen before. Every day we see things happening that are changing the foreign trade environment, and this is, of course, causing pauses to plan well, and when there is uncertainty, it's impossible to plan for the long run. The USMCA, we know it was signed. We had a great presentation by Dr. Seade, but it still causes uncertainty because we don't know when it's going to become effective. We hear rumors about dates, we hear different options, but at least myself, I have not seen any specific date, effective date. And that creates uncertainty, and that can become a factor when we have to decide if we're going to invest in this market or not. Dr. Seade mentioned the increase in the regional content for the auto part sector. That's fantastic because that's going to pull the manufacture of auto parts to Mexico to fill out this 75%. But for the car assembly market, it's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit more complicated mainly because of the labor value, those $16 in minimum wage per hour that are necessary to qualify a vehicle for the USMCA. I hope that when the regulations that we mentioned a while ago, the uniform regulations, we have a formula to calculate that, but we know that to get to $16 per hour in Mexico is going to be very complicated for the industry, and that's going to have a negative impact on the manufacture of vehicles in the country, and it could perhaps create opportunities for other countries with lower costs of production if they try to bring up the wage, if they try to comply with those $16 per hour. Brazil or Argentina could become attractive countries for the investment in vehicle assembly. However, for auto parts, it should create a boom in the industry to create more product in Mexico that will comply with that 75% of regional content. At the same time, we have new opportunities, as I mentioned before, to export from Mexico. We see that 80% is export, 75% of it goes to the U.S., but we have the CPTPP, which hasn't been making too much noise, but opens new markets for Mexico. ACE 55 for auto parts. ACE 55 is a commercial trade agreement for Mexico, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina in the automotive sector. So even though we are in a permanent disruption period, and we think this is the new rule, we think that we're never going to have periods that are as long as the ones that we had with NAFTA, where foreign trade was stable and wouldn't change too much. We're in a new era where every day we're going to see new things, and we think that the USMCA is going to be good for Mexico, will create employment, will create exports in the region, but we do have to see this correctly and analyze it correctly, and to expect the uniform rules, to understand the rules of the game.
I rushed a little bit because we have time restrictions. Chris, try to catch up with the time. Okay, ciertamente no quería.
Which I think is excellent. Let's see if we have one or two questions whilst, before we do our ideas lab. Does anybody have any question they'd like to pose to Javier on any of the issues that we're talking about here? Maybe quickly, do you think are you as optimistic about the benefits of that extra protection in terms of bringing more inward investment to produce parts here? Or do you think actually some manufacturers will struggle, at least in the short to medium term, to reach and meet those new requirements?
Well, changing a supply chain for the automotive industry is very complicated. You can't do it overnight. Yeah. It's going to take time. It's going to take time to start bringing new industries to Mexico or to the region that we didn't have before, to start building plants, to start being able to supply those parts to the OEMs. Eventually, I think it'll be fantastic and we'll get there, but not in the short term. In the short term, you can't just shut down a plant somewhere else, build it here. You have to go through quality control processes, et cetera. It's going to take a while to get it done.
And what about the prospects for Mexico as a potential future location for electric vehicles and batteries? Because at the moment it's on a very low scale, as you indicated. I mean,
production or sales? I think both.
I think production. Let's talk about production for a minute.
I think there's definitely opportunity here. I mean, the trend is going towards electric vehicles. Mexico is still, one of the largest consumption regions in North America. There has to be more building of vehicles in the region. Mexico is a logical choice, but also we're seeing the sale of those electric vehicles in Mexico should continue to grow tremendously at exponential rates.
And finally, just for me, and then I'm going to want to bring our ideas labs, coronavirus. Do you see long-term impacts? Obviously, the short-term is catastrophic, but do you see long-term in terms of maybe changing supply chain flows to kind of mitigate these things?
I wish I had a crystal ball. Yes, I think there will be long-term consequences. One thing that's clear is that supply chains were not ready to deal with something like this. And we see suppliers in China that can't ship their product out because they don't have the products there. They just don't have anybody to process it to ship it, right? So this should tell the logistics industry, the supply chain industry, we need to have a plan B on how to move goods in a case such as this.
Yeah, absolutely. Javier, I really appreciate your time and your insight. It's been fantastic.